Today we are going to be taking a closer look at the treaties creating the European Union. Let's begin by taking a closer look at the European Coal and Steel Treaty, or the Treaty of Paris, which came into effect in 1952. The first treaty in the process leading to the establishment of the European Union, or the EU, was the European Coal and Steel Treaty, creating the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951. Its signatory states, Germany, France, Italy and the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, recognised that coal and steel were the main ingredients or components of war, and that by placing these raw materials under common control, war between the member states could be avoided. Although coming to an end in 2002, the treaty was nevertheless of vital importance as it sowed the seeds for the later creation of the European Union. To manage its member state coal and steel industries collectively, the ECSC established four main institutions: the High Authority, later the European Commission, the Special Council of Ministers, later the Council of the European Union, the High Assembly, which later became the European Parliament, and the Court of Justice, which later became the European Court of Justice. These remain the four main institutions of the present-day European Union. Now let's take a look at the European Economic Community Treaty, also known as the EEC Treaty or the Treaty of Rome, signed in 1957. The European Economic Community Treaty was signed in 1957 and established the European Economic Community or EEC. Its membership was originally the same as the ECSC, but over time it expanded to the 28 member states that now make up the European Union. The EEC Treaty has been amended many times, extending its scope beyond purely economic matters to socio-economic issues such as workers' and citizens' rights. Reflecting this evolution, the name of the European Economic Community was shortened to the European Community, or EC, in 1992 under the Treaty on European Union, also referred to as the Maastricht Treaty, or TEU, and after the Lisbon Treaty, the EC Treaty was replaced by the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and the EC ceased to exist as a separate entity, becoming an integral part of the EU. The general aims of the EC can be summed up as 1. The promotion of harmonious economic development in each of the member states. 2. The promotion of employment. 3. The creation of a high level of social protection for citizens. 4. The establishment of equality between citizens and the elimination of discrimination. And 5. The furtherance of social cohesion within European society. To allow the achievement of these aims, the Treaty of Rome proposed greater economic integration between its member states, providing for the development of common economic policies between its member states. Common policies have been developed in areas such as agriculture, the CAP, and in the area of transport, the TEN-T programme. The purpose behind the CAP, or the CAP, is to develop a mechanised, efficient agricultural industry so as to ensure EU food security. The EC also provided for the creation of an internal or single market between its member states. The internal market, also known as a single market, is a trading bloc in which goods, workers, services and capital can move freely between member states without the imposition of barriers. The creation of the single market involved the establishment of a common external customs policy as regards the rest of the non-EU world, and a customs union as regards intra-community member state trade. The EC also created a common competition policy. EU competition policy seeks to promote the efficient allocation of resources throughout the Union. Under EU competition law, businesses are prevented from acting in a non-competitive manner. Anti-competitive behaviour can occur if a company in a monopoly position abuses its market power, or if two or more companies enter into an agreement between them to restrict competition. EU competition law also seeks to regulate state aid given by member states to their home industries. Nearly 30 years after its adoption, in 1957, it was considered necessary to amend the provisions of the EEC Treaty. And these amendments were set out in the Single European Act, or the SEA, which took effect in 1987. The SEA was introduced to achieve a number of aims. The first was to promote the creation of the internal market. Under the institutional regime established by the EEC Treaty, legislative power was vested in the Council of Ministers, acting at unanimity. The result of the unanimity requirement was that very few legislative initiatives creating the internal market were actually adopted, as unanimous agreement between the member states was difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. To overcome this problem, the SEA introduced qualified majority voting, or QMV, thereby preventing individual member states from having a power of veto as regards the adoption of single market legislative proposals. The SEA was also introduced to increase the role of the European Parliament. As the activities of the EC grew, it was considered necessary to better democratise the process of European integration. To achieve this, the role of the European Parliament in the adoption of legislation was increased. And the third measure that the SEA introduced was to formalise certain practices such as European political cooperation, or EPC, between member states. Limited cooperation in foreign affairs had been occurring between the member states on an informal basis since the early 1970s. Pursuant to the provisions of the SEA, member state cooperation on foreign affairs was given formal treaty status, leading to the later creation of the post of High Representative of the European Union. The role of the High Representative is to coordinate member state foreign policy and to represent the European Union in matters concerning foreign affairs. As member states had successfully integrated their economies under the EEC Treaty, they began to take the first tentative steps towards greater political and social union. The SEA sought to confirm this evolution, and to some extent, the treaty can be considered as a bridge between the economic integration established by the EEC and the subsequent political and social integration established by the soon-to-be adopted Treaty on the European Union. In 1992, the Treaty on European Union, or TEU, was signed, creating a new organisation called the European Union. The TEU established three separate pillars under which European integration was to take place. The first was economic integration, in line with the provisions of the newly named EC Treaty. The EU also set to put in place integration in the area of common foreign and security policy according to the provisions of the newly adopted TEU Treaty. And finally, the treaty also sought to put in place integration in the area of justice and home affairs. Thereafter, the Treaty of Amsterdam came into force in 1999, reinforcing the political and social character of the newly created European Union, or EU. The most significant achievement of the treaty was to further extend the legislative powers of the European Parliament under the co-decision procedure, thereby reinforcing the democratic credentials of the Union. Further, under the terms of the treaty, the intergovernmental non-EU Schengen Agreement, providing for the free movement of persons between certain EU member states, was also formally incorporated into the EU framework. In 2003, the Treaty of Nice was adopted, and as we have seen, its purpose was to reorganise the institutions of the Union, giving them the necessary flexibility so as to allow for enlargement. The institutional organisations of the European Union continued to reflect the basic institutional model established in 1952 and 1957 when the community had only 6 member states. This institutional organisation was not appropriate for what was soon to be a union of 28 member states. Thus, the Nice Treaty sought to simplify the process leading to the adoption of EU legislation. By restricting the power of the dissenting member states to block the legislative process, it did this primarily by extending the number of areas subject to QMV system of voting, thereby further restricting the member states' power of veto. Finally, the Treaty of Nice adopted a non-binding Charter on Human Rights into the EU legal framework. In 2009, the Treaty of Lisbon, or the Reform Treaty, was adopted. Previous to this, in October 2004, in an attempt to consolidate the laws established in each of the above-mentioned treaties, the member state governments signed a new consolidating treaty referred to as the Treaty Establishing a Constitution for Europe, the TCE, which had then to be ratified individually by each of the member states. Although ratified by 18 member states, the voters of Ireland, France and the Netherlands rejected the treaty at national referendum. And following the rejection of the TCE, the EU member states decided to adopt a scaled-down reform treaty referred to as the Lisbon Treaty in its place. Modelled on the TCE, the Lisbon Treaty introduced significant changes into EU law. For example, and as seen before, it merged the European Community with the European Union. It created a new office of President of the European Council. It provided for EU accession to the European Convention on Human Rights. It simplified the procedure governing the adoption of legislation at the EU level. It extended the legislative role of the European Parliament, and it provided for the right of member states to leave the Union. We hope you enjoyed this look at the treaties creating the European Union.